Hey there. Right, today I'm not going to talk about any of my books or any of my projects. Um, what I'm going to talk about is really kind of based my, how can you put it, obsession, if you like. I've always been intrigued and interested in true crime, in interesting characters, but it wasn't until about June or July 2012 when someone said, when you get a minute, Jamie, can you have a look at type in Wakefield Paul Sykes? So I did. Name never meant anything to me. I'm one of them that, I've got to kind of be pushed. I've got to be really, really impressed to do it. And I'd never heard the name. I'd heard all of Jack the Ripper and your Craze and all these kind of things. And I'd never, at the time I was like 32. So I'd been reading true crime really from the age of 10. And I'd been really studying the sport of boxing, like in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. I'm, very clued up. And I'd heard of John L. Gardner. Who else? I'd heard of Neville Mead and a couple of others, but I'd never heard of this Paul Sykes. So to cut a long story short, I typed in Paul Sykes on YouTube. Back in them days, I should say 7 years ago, there used to be, or 8 years ago now, there was 7 links, and I think the documentary in total adds up to something like 56 and a half minutes. Documentary, what was on YouTube, was about 25 minutes. So I watched that and I was just like, wow, who the hell's that guy? How have I never heard of him? what an interesting character. I was like, right, so, and just watched him again. It turns out at the time, someone was selling copies of the full documentary for about £5 at the time. So after watching the documentaries, listening to all you guys, I've read the thousands and thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of comments now over the years, because the video keeps getting put on. Obviously ITV are aware of it now because of my influences with the books, which have been signed to be a film, which I'll come to that a little bit later on. But at the time, all that was about, YouTube came into play. I googled it November 2006, so it was about six months before Paul died, which is a shame really, because I think a lot of people would have looked at him a bit differently. Them kids are used to piss on him and set fire to him and walk past and go, "You mister," crack an egg on him or make him shed a box for £1. It would have been far more interesting, and I think people would have realised who they were dealing with or what once upon a time this figure was. So I watched the full documentary and then I realised he had a book. So I was like, right, I need this book. But the only problem was, at the time, was Paul released this book he written it from 1985 to 88. Released it in, hang on, when did he get out of prison? 89. So he released it in 1990. So there was only ever 10,000 copies ever made. There was allegedly another 2,000 copies. I'm not quite sure. So the figures are, which I'll take as a fact, were between 10 to 12,000 copies were done. Now, getting hold of these, I'd seen some of these prices for like £300. The average one back in 8 years ago, nearly 8.5 years ago now, was about 80, 70 quid. I done quite well. I managed to buy one for about £45. And I read it because what I wanted to know, when you watch that Paul Sykes documentary, you Google him and he finds out, I say it all the time, that it's like Cinderella at midnight. Her special powers go and she turns into a pumpkin. And for some reason, well, yes, there's, the obvious reasons, which, we'll go into in a bit. But this big monster of a man that you see filmed in, it was released, Paul Sykes at Large, on December the 4th, 1990. In a space of 10 years, he's gone from the scariest thing you could possibly imagine to this kind of frail old... And you read... I read the story. I found out the full SP. He turned into a tramp. He was a frail old man. He died... let me think. He'd been dead just over 5 years by that point. So I was like, right. So I wanted to know more about him. So I thought, right, I bought the book. And yes, I got a copy for £45, but the downside for me was that book was written from March 1977 until June the 26th, 1979. So if anything, it only informs you of this fascinating character 10 years previously to the one I just watched. So basically, I was like, right, I must have just spent 3 years. I remember talking to someone on a building site when I was working. Must have been about 6 months after I first come across Paul Sykes. And I was working on some building anyway, and I picked this Yorkshire accent up. It sounded a bit, and I was like, "Where are you from?" He went, "Oh, Wakefield, lad." And I was like, "Fuck off, really?" And I think this was I'd kind of done that for a couple of years, and then got to the point in 2015 where I just thought, "Fuck it, I'll hold my glass, hold my coat, and I'll write it myself." Long story short, I went on to do 3 books. Warcry Press have done their own. It's Sharks. And we've done very well. We've had 3 bestsellers. Starting to be a film by Western Edge Pictures. Due to start September this year. Obviously, God had different plans with COVID-19. Put a span in the works. Touch wood, it will happen next year. Main 80s band allegedly has been asked to do the soundtrack. There's a very famous guy playing the part of Paul. So, but I don't really want to talk about that because I've talked about that loads of times in the past. I just want to talk about this documentary. So, when I got the full one, listen, I don't mind admitting, to be quite brutally honest, if I'd never seen that documentary in my entire life, I would have never written a book. And now I've got 18 books on Amazon. 2 documentaries and another one out. So I've got like 3 documentaries. And it was basically, it sounds mad because I never knew Paul Sykes. I never met him. I'm never going to pretend I ever did. I know a few people have said, "Oh, well, how can he write a book when he never knew him?" Listen, how can people write books on Jack the Ripper and Adolf Hitler? Unless they're still about and they're 147 years old or something like that. But what I did was, you've read the books and you've seen the links, and I've got family members, enemies, all these kind of things. But I want to just talk about the documentary, and I will fully admit I was totally and utterly blown away, like many of yous, like many celebrities. I've spoken to. I mean, I've met and went to meet the documentary makers. Let me think. Roger Greenwood and Nick Claude, and we met at a plush hotel in Harrogate, which is where they used to meet Paul. Paul's only sibling Kay came with us that day, and we had a catch up. They had a laugh, winced a few times at a few things. Paul hit certainly one of the makers because he told me so when he was making it. Obviously Kay has her own issues with the abuse a big brother given, and I fully understand that, and I do deeply sympathise. Yeah. And that was the reason why she walked away and couldn't do the projects, which, I deleted all my photos, and I just respected what her wishes. But going back to the documentary, listen, I've spoke to people like Ricky Gervais on Twitter. I've spoken to boxers such as Wayne Alexander, Michael Jennings, Ishan Pickering. I was talking to a girl doing quite well, Savannah Marshall. I think she fought for a world title the other day. I won one. There's Robbie Williams said to the filmmakers, he said some of my most entertaining nights were watching Paul Sykes at large eating Chris sandwiches. Jamie Carragher, absolutely obsessed with Paul Sykes, often talks about it. Celebrities, your Bob Mortimers, the League of Gentlemen. And it's a lot of them have took comedy sketches away, and because he's just this, one comedian, which I put it in the book, I won't name, but he said you meet a Paul Sykes every time you go on a Wetherspoons, and it was just, these characters, some of these really millionaire, Joe Public, civilised people who are not into glorifying crime can't help but sit back and watch that documentary and just think, what the fuck? And then next week, they just watch it again and again and again. And listen, I know a lot of people like that, and I'm just one of them that I don't mind admitting. I've probably watched that documentary about 108 times. The only woman I'm allowed to call my wife by a different name. I often, the one-liners in it are staggering. What these lights doing on Calf, and I told him he's statutory right in prison, and like Paul's book Sweet Agony, the documentary is absolutely littered with incredibly comical one-liners. And I've met a lot of these characters as well. Delroy Showers, which I often I speak to, and maybe if you watch these, I'm a bit conscious of repeating myself, but I do often say he is the most, I would say, interesting character, criminal from a criminal, but I'd probably say he's one of the most interesting characters I've ever met, full stop. The guy speaks 6 different languages, never had a drink in his life, never smoked. He's only about 5'5". He was 70 not so long back, and he looks, you place him for 50. Very eloquent, intellectual guy, highly intellectual. He's a prime example of a chameleon, because you could put Delroy in the community of Toxteth, where he's from, and he would mix in like a chameleon. And then you could put him in Buckingham Palace with Derek Lord from Big Brother, having a cup of tea with Chris Eubank, and the guy's phenomenal. He's actually got degrees in education, and that was the thing about Paul Sykes. People think, I've read some of the things, and people say he went this, and he had a cup of tea there, and he was in Moscow and the Ivory Coast. He did actually go to all them places, although very briefly he did. And his education came from inside prison. He had one of these brains, which is called, what's the word Delroy Showers always, Germanic, I think. It's literally where he doesn't want to waste a second of every day, and every day something productive has to be done. Paul would do The Guardian or the Daily Telegraph crossword in 20 minutes. And if anyone's ever tried that, it's absolutely mind-blowing. If you've never tried it, go and buy your paper tomorrow or Monday and try it, and you think, Jesus. And 20 minutes, he used to do that. I've met many of the characters. Kenny the Tailor, spoke to him. he was about 85. When was this? About 4 years ago, and he's still going strong. Still looks exactly the same, maybe a bit lesser hair. And he's 89 now. And I meet a lot of kind of famous people or infamous people over the years, footballers, boxers, and yeah, they're just people, But years ago, when I was younger, you think you get a bit starstruck. But you know what? Actually, meeting someone like Kenny, it's just because I'm so into the documentary. I've met Kay. She was briefly in the documentary when you watch the wedding and you see the lady go like that, not wanting to be on camera because Walter didn't want her on. Who else? Yeah, Delroy. I've been into prison and I visited Paul Sykes Jr. Yeah, but then there's other characters as well, like Dennis Flint, who sadly passed quite young, 2001, and he was only in his mid-60s. The makers of that Paul Sykes documentary, there was something in the pipeline where they said, listen, I know it's only when you only see Dennis for something like 2.5 minutes, but I can't think of much better British television. And I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised people like Bob Mortimer has done spoofs. Yeah, that guy. It's really, really sad that it's I've spoke to a couple of Dennis's family about the possibility of doing a book, because he was a character you almost think is so bizarre that he's made up, but it's actually true. He really was this millionaire guy, sat there in expensive shirts, drinking whiskey, smoking the best cigars, the finest wig money could buy. He loved Italian opera, Pavarotti, played golf every day. He really was a real life character that you just thought, my God, I would have loved to have met him. Could you imagine his story? His story was actually he was never a criminal. He built up his money in the car business in like the 50s, working like Singapore, places abroad. Yeah, that documentary, there has so many characters. I've just named a few there, like Kenny the Tailor. But who can forget Too True? I'm just trying to pick my words. That amazing two-piece band. Sadly, one of them's no longer here now. They were sisters. Excuse me, and that was in the Lups at Workmen's Club. I was fortunate enough to go in a couple of years back, but it got knocked down about 2 years ago, I believe. So the scene of the greatest ever raffle, where Patrick Mackay kindly donated one of his finest pieces of art. Patrick Mackay, if anyone doesn't know, I know people think Charles Bronson's Britain's longest ever serving prisoner, but he's not. Bronson was let out in mid-70s for about 10 weeks or something, 9 weeks. So statistically, Patrick Mackay, and rumour has it he's up for parole next year. The guy now must have done something like, oh my God, 46, 47 years, something like that. Yeah. There was just the documentary was just littered, and it was all based mainly on the Lupset estate, which, I mean, I've been many times. I've been in the house because obviously with the film's going to happen hopefully it is going to happen. It's just when the world goes back to normality. But the film director and the documentary, because there's going to be two, which is a bit like there was a Lenny McLean film and the documentary. That's the plan. There's going to be the film and there's going to be the documentary. And he just they asked me once, I said, look, what's it like? What does it look like? So I went in, and I couldn't help. I couldn't, when I was in that kitchen, I had to stop myself from saying, "What are these lights doing on calf?" When I walked in the front room, I couldn't help but see Delroy say, "I feel like a rather large gooseberry." It was, and almost when I went on the corner and I stood at 29 Gloucestershire Road, which was the Sykes home for 37 years. When I was stood at the spot where Walter Sykes was, where he's doing his, I used to give him a penny for all them and push-ups, and I was like that with the phone. You could see the back, you could see the city of Wakefield in the back. Yeah, I just think it was really sad because the makers said to me, they said, that's the biggest thing they ever did. I mean, career-wise, Nick Lord and Roger Greenwood said there wasn't much better. And a lot of people think Roger Greenwood come and found Paul Sykes. The actual truth, there was a guy called Fred Dinage, and he used to work for, let me think. He'd written a book about the Cray twins, but he was very much to do with Yorkshire television, and Fred Dinage basically come across Sykes. Well, if you notice when Paul's had his first fight and he's saying what now, and Paul's saying 750 birds like Joe Bugner, blocks of flats, all that. That's Fred Dinage interviewing him, and basically Fred kept in touch with Paul during the mid-80s. I read between the lines from what I've spoken to various people connected. It got too much for Fred Dinage, and he just basically said, "Look, probably not for me, Paul," because he did used to go visit him in prisons. Roger Greenwood and that did, but listen, and he contacted Roger Greenwood and said in the mid-80s when I think he was in Nottingham prison, and he said to Roger Greenwood, he said, "Listen, I've got this guy, and he could be comedy gold. He's a walking documentary." They got to know each other for a number of years, and to cut a long story short, the iconic, absolutely legendary Paul Sykes at Large was made. Yeah, so there was plans for a documentary too. Probably around a decade after. I spoke to the makers, the filmmakers, and they said we really, really considered it to the point we actually went to Wakefield. But by that point, Paul, how can I put it, he wasn't coherent. He wasn't, the lights were on, but nobody was in. And if they would have filmed, yes, it would have got the numbers and that, but I think it would have been basically that they would have never lived it down. It would have just basically taken the piss out of a guy who was extremely vulnerable by that point. Yeah, the education thing with Paul, it was all learnt in prison. Didn't have any education at school. It was all taught in prison. All the degree he got in Manchester University in 1982, that was inside prison. Strange ways. The diploma he got, what else was it he got? He got A levels, he got O levels. I've got it written down somewhere, or it's in the books. But he also had a passion for punching people's lights out. And I spoke to, I won't name him, but a very well-known man around that circle who was very familiar with Paul's circle. And he said the reason Paul was so aggressive, if you like, was he imagined it that if you put a shark in a little small bowl, it will stay small. Where if you let it out, I mean, this is British sharks we're talking about, they'll grow 8 feet. And basically, he said to me, the reason Paul Sykes was the way he was was because he outgrown his what's the word? He outgrown his surroundings, So when he was remarkable for knowing every capital in the world. If he was dropped in the jungle, he'd know what snakes to eat and not to eat to survive. The knowledge he had, it was absolutely frightening. And he would study 4 books a week. He read, and that's from a government. That was someone who said 4 books in prison. He used to. This is bearing in mind there was no televisions back then. Paul wouldn't even listen to the radio. He'd kind of listen to plays, or he'd listen to like maybe cricket matches or that kind of thing. But it was always he always trained his brain. Obviously he trained his body in that documentary. I've spoken to a former powerlifter quite recently, and I said, "Can you tell me what he's lifting?" On that documentary, which was it was released December the 4th, 1990. Paul was let out September the 11th, 89. So he would have been 42, 43 when he was lifting that. And he said to me, he's lifting 225 kilos. And I said, is that good for a 43-year-old? And he said, it's good for any age. So not only was he good with his fists and the boxing, he was ridiculously strong. So in a fighting manner, I suppose he was the ultimate package. Plus he had that bit of nastiness. The police have told me when they'd get him mob-handed with 12, that he'd turn and he'd spit at them, and and he'd say disgusting things about wife, and he really, really did have a bad streak. But he was a one-off. And listen, I know some people in Wakefield would rather I never come along, and there's no books, there's no film next year, there's no documentary. To 85%, he puts shame on the city of Wakefield. And if I was from Wakefield, listen, I'm an outsider, over 70 miles away looking in. But for a small time, even just for them 2 years, Paul Sykes did put Wakefield on the map. And a lot of people do forget that. And who's the most famous person from Wakefield ever? Is it Jay McDonald? Is it Paul Sykes? I certainly think he's in the top 3. He's certainly the reason why I never, when I was young, I used to, travel all over boxing clubs and that, and Wakefield, to me, was just one of them places like Coventry or Milton Keynes, where you knew they existed, but you didn't really know anything about it. And then obviously Wakefield's kind of become a place of great interest to me and to many others, because many have said to me, right, I'm watching this documentary, where was a so-and-so, and that they came from Newcastle, Derby, all them kind of things. So the documentary overall, I fully understand more than anyone, and many of you will be watching this, many will be thinking, shut up, drop it now. And a lot of you will be thinking exactly the same. We'll be watching that documentary, was as gripped as I was, wanted to know the story, and then when you found out the story, you wanted to know why, how, and there's sadness in it. It's sad, it's tragic. I've spoken to many people in that Wakefield Boys Club, and would I have sent my son? No, but this was 30 years ago. Society was a bit different. You can see he had his heart in the right place, but sending your kid to him or not, as he says, send your kids to me and I'll look after him, and I'll bully him and I'll train him, and they're the calluses of mankind and they're going soft because there's no work to be done. I think it's a great idea, but obviously Paul had his ways, and nobody was going to change that. but he's the documentary. I don't think that's gonna, it keeps getting put on, and ITV are aware now with the film and the documentary. People know they can charge £400 per second. People know it's growing. There's books out there. There's people writing songs. There's also people making like little spoof documentaries. The Ghost of Paul Sykes has just been done. People have done plays on YouTube by Boyle and Shaw, nothing to do with me, and that's called The Sins of My Father. If you YouTube it, Barry Tebb has written poems on Paul Sykes, and it's just growing, growing and growing, and yeah, maybe I probably did get the ball rolling, and he'd been dead 5 years, and people forgot about him, but. That documentary was something else. And I'm not just saying this as, listen, I'm not a fan of Paul Sykes. He did some monstrous, wicked, terrible, terrible things that the stuff that I know, I didn't even put in the book, didn't even want my name to be involved in it. I did speak, however, to, I won't name him, but he was a former top retired chief of Wakefield Police. And Paul Sykes' criminal record was staggering, absolutely staggering, as in I think 231 was something like a figure he gave me. And I know a lot of people say, oh, well, he was a nonce and he was this and he was that. Listen, I've been in prison with Paul Sykes Jr. and he said if our dad was here now, he'd say, yeah, I used to have sex with men. But what I'm going to tell you is a fact, right? This is a fact because I've spoken to over 8 years, several police officers, but I spoke to a really, really major one who had access to all that. Paul Sykes never, ever was convicted of any crimes. So that's not my opinion, that's a fact. And I was allowed to put that in the book, which I've just did, Sykes Final Agony. So yeah, listen, you watch that documentary and it's disturbing, Obviously, people think, oh, well, look at his 2 sons. No wonder that they're doing life in prison. Paul Sykes, I know of, had eight sons, 7 biological I know of, and 1 he brought up in his own. But the 2 on that documentary, one was on life, one's doing life now, who's maybe not a million miles away from getting out, if he's rehabilitated. And the other one wasn't on the documentary. So there's a lot more sons. I just don't think Paul Sykes could produce girls. There's certainly a lot of Sykes boys out there. And that's all I'll say on that matter, because it's not for me to say. But overall, on that documentary, you can't, it's like I watched The Joker last year. And when something really hits home on you, when something really makes an impression on you, it stays in your mind for days. And I was thinking of that film for days. And when I watched Paul Sykes, it stuck in my mind probably for 3 years. And then I just decided, I thought, you know what? Because I approached several authors and I said, listen, no one's ever done a book on him. Yes, he done his own in 1990, but this guy surely merits some kind of many crime books, because I've read a lot of books that, in my opinion, certainly they're not really worth the paper they're printed on, and I've seen the films and documentaries on some people. Paul Sykes is... yeah, he's a character that is, I don't know, how would you describe him? You couldn't possibly sum him up in one word. Genius, psychopath. John Spencer, his mentor, said to me, he said, Paul was, he was a genius. He was literally a genius who could do anything. But if you put him in charge of a newsagent, he'd fucking wreck it. He just, he was a genius with the hard things in life, but the simple things in life he would just completely ruin. And I think that sums him up quite, I think he was just, I definitely think there was, in my opinion, I spoke to his sister and I counted 22 prisons he'd been in, and they'd done many tests on him, doctors. He'd been tested for everything. And to my knowledge, he was never mentally... I know he was in 2001. He was in Stanley Royd. He was off alcohol. He was on the Valium, and but that was really for like alcoholism. But when he was in his prime, you know, when he was in his 20s and 30s and even 40s, people, you know, he was examined by the best the British penal system offered, and they never found anything. The police officer said to me they definitely thought he had issues, he had mental health issues. And today we live in 2021 where it's much more spoken of. 30, 40 years ago it didn't exist, and if it was brought up, it would say, oh, behave, you puff. And especially in Yorkshire, they say, what's the matter with you, lad? I can't do an accent, but let's get a pint down you. And that was the kind of thing. And Paul was a man's man. He was a very man's man. I think hugely responsible for the way he was